This is Bumping Into, where we have interesting conversations with people from all walks of life.
Welcome to Bumping Into. I am Francis Populin. Anyone that's interested in history will love today's episode. I'm joined by Professor Peter Fritzsche, who is not only a professor of history at the University of Illinois, but also the author of a new book called Hitler's First 100 Days. If you're anything like me, you would have wondered, how was Hitler able to do what he did? How did he get into power? And how did he keep doing the things that he did all throughout World War II? All is answered in this episode. We start out at World War I. We move into Hitler being elected into power, and then right through to World War II and after the war. It's a long conversation. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to Peter. Towards the end, we discussed the lines of similarity with many of today's world events, which some of you may find interesting. After that, Peter starts talking about life in America and their political system, offering a bit of an insight into, I suppose, how it is all unfolding over there post-Trump. If anyone wants to hang around after that. It was a great wide-ranging and engaging conversation with Peter, and I encourage anyone interested in World War II or Hitler or wants to know more about how Hitler came into power to grab a copy of his book called Hitler's First 100 Days. Hi Peter, how you going?
Hi, how are you?
I'm really good.
I was just finishing up preparing for dinner. Yeah, you're waiting for your breakfast. I understand that.
Yeah. I was up bright and early. I've already been for a walk and got all that out of the way and come back. So it worked out well. So thank you very much for making the time to hang back and do this in your Friday afternoon.
Oh, my pleasure.
I wanted to, I suppose, and look, this is probably what I was thinking, is we create a broad timeline to sort of, I suppose, understand how your book and what we're going to talk about fits in. So I've made a few notes, and pull me up if any of this is wrong. So if we were to, I suppose, summary this, we've got World War I, which was 1914 to 1918. We then had the Spanish flu, which was 1918 to 1920. We then went through the Roaring 20s, so 1920 to 29, the Great Depression, 29 to 33. And then we had World War II kick in 1939 to 45. And then after that, the baby boomer period of 46 to 64. I suppose that to me, I sort of wanted to create an overall picture of, I suppose, a bit pre and a bit post, because they're big events and a lot of cultural changes especially happened after the Second World War. Would that be the main defining things as you would see?
Yeah, I mean, this is a period that encompasses precisely the life of my grandparents.
Right. Okay. Yep.
So my grandfather was a World War I veteran, and my grandmother witnessed the reunification of Germany at the other end. So that's a perfectly fine timeline.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. Okay. So now that we've got that, obviously, I suppose you're probably the best person I wanted to summarize, I guess, if people are going to listen, to give them an understanding, before we get to the 100 days of Hitler there. World War I, which Germany lost, what was the precursor? What was the reasoning behind World War I for them entering or starting?
Well, World War I, let me just sort of start backwards. After World War I, the biggest common denominator in European politics is pacifism, right and left, that we can't possibly have another World War I, because the next one will be even worse and will destroy our cities, will destroy our civilization. So what people learned from World War I is completely at odds with how it began, which is a struggle of Serbian nationalism, Serbian national claims on Serbian ethnics in the Austrian Empire, made poignant by the assassination of the Archduke on his visit to Sarajevo. Unluckily, it's the biggest Serbian national holiday commemorating the Turkish victory over the Serbs in 1389. So June 28th, 1914 is when the Archduke comes, but it's a small terrorist group that doesn't really have established links to the small Serbian state that exists. And through a series of really crazy events, they managed to kill the Archduke and his wife on their state visit to Sarajevo. So 2 people die, and then the whole thing explodes into this world war in which 12 million soldiers and to some extent civilians sacrificed their lives. Austria wanted to be tough on Serbia. Russia wanted on Serbia's behalf to be tough on Austria. Germany wanted Austria to remain tough because it felt itself surrounded in Europe. All the countries thought that there was a narrow windows of opportunity in order to establish their national claims. But nobody believed that this regional problem would result in a long-lasting continental war with British entry, with the expeditionary force, much less, Australian, New Zealand, Indian participation, and 4 years of slaughter. So there's a World War I is the perfect example of irony, where there is no relationship between the origins and the consequences. But the origins are that Austria in 1914 cannot see national liberation movements inside its multinational empire, because that would spell the end of the Austrian Empire. It cannot have Polish independence movements, Czech independence movements, Croatian, Serbian. And therefore, it had to have a hard line against what it believed was Serbian terrorism against the Austrian Empire. And that's the beginning of the war. But Russia feels it has a interest because the Slavs and the Serbs certainly are, they're Slav and they're Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. And so there it begins. Everyone thinks they have a finger in the pie. But the way the whole thing exploded was unanticipated and was certainly not what people expected. But the end result is, you take country by country by country. 2 million dead in Germany, 2 million wounded and crippled. And with similar proportions, 1.5 million dead in France, 1.5 million wounded. 1.3 million in Great Britain. And most of the bodies, or just about half of the bodies, are never recovered.
Wow,
they're never
incredible.
recovered. They're still sitting there in northern France and Belgium. And so this is just a calamity that is very, very difficult for Americans to understand.
Yeah.
The enormity of the consequences. And so the origins and the brutality of the war are just two totally different things. But by 1918, people emerge. They're not thinking about Serbia. They're not thinking about the Archduke. They're thinking about what Western civilization can do to itself in terms of technology and killing procedures. And never again, that word is used first about World War I, not about the Holocaust. Never again a world war. Anything would be worse. Nothing could be worse than a world war. So that is how people emerge in the early 1920s.
And you've got obviously Germany. What was it that Germany was trying to achieve in World War I? What was their main push? Was it invasion, just to conquer more land? Is that the basic?
Well, one has to remember when one talks about Germany, one's talking about the particular government structure at the time. And so while there's a parliament and the biggest party in the parliament are the socialists, the government has no accountability to the parliament. So the government is at the Kaiser's, at the emperor's behest, what he wants. And that's the old military and political elites. And they first see the war as defensive because of Russian mobilization against Germany and Austria. But they very quickly realize that any victory, first of all, there's the opportunity of victory, then you can expand your spheres of interest. But once the war starts costing so much in men and treasure, you have to make sure that the victory that you have is so decisive that you can pay for the war. And so very quickly, a war that's at first seen as defensive becomes a war of aggression, and an offensive war with sliding but increasingly ambitious war aims, in which Germany really would stake its spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. And that's what one sees after the Russian Revolution in the makeshift peace that the Germans forced the Russians to sign in January 1918, where there's this huge ring of German client states, Ukraine, Duchy of Poland, and so on. And much of the old Russian Empire has been gobbled up by that belt. So it becomes very quickly an aggressive war, which registers the huge stakes of treasure and lives.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's not that long ago. We're not talking about Roman times or the Vikings. It's just incredible to think this happened not that long ago.
No, I mean, the last, World War I veterans have just died a few years ago. And I just heard that a cartoonist for Walt Disney died at the age of 111.
Wow.
So she was born in 1910 and would have remembered the armistice celebrations in the United States. Wow. It's my grandfather's generation. But but in the end, there is a broad consensus for peace and for the end of the war in 1918. And the German Revolution is not an unhappy or unpopular event. And it's the end of militarism, it's the end of the Kaiser, it's the end of the war, it's the end of a healing process in a very difficult moment, which involves a food blockade, coal shortages, and of course the influenza epidemic. And so it's only slowly in the 1920s when Germans, and again, not all, but influential ones, start to think about refighting World War I. But that does characterize German politics by the end of the 1920s.
So obviously, I think that the story is that Hitler was very bitter about Germany's loss, and he was obviously keen to go back into war. But and that, I guess, ultimately led to the start of the Germany involvement in World War II.
Yes, I mean, the war is Hitler's political school.
Yeah.
And he serves for 4 years, a long 4 years, and he is in a dangerous position as a messenger between units. He earns the Iron Cross, once at the beginning, once at the end of the war. And then he returns to Munich, and the revolution takes ever more radical forms. And so for him, in his mind, Germany's defeat at the hands of the Allies is completely entangled in his resentments of the enemies at home who have weakened Germany to the point of creating and then radicalizing this revolution and bringing up the threat of Bolshevism. So he sees Germany imperiled both at home and abroad. And that means you need a tough, preemptive counter-revolutionary policy. Utterly violent and utterly merciless. First against the enemies at home, whom he designates as communists and socialists and Jews. And then, of course, against the European allies that almost destroyed the existence of Germany at the Treaty of Versailles, in his view. Right. And this extreme way of thinking about Germany's fall and rise is increasingly legitimate and popular, becomes increasingly legitimate and popular. And that's the Nazis' great success by the eve of World War II to really convince Germans that this is the story of how we would narrate the last 25 years.
And I guess that's probably where your book comes into play from that point, I guess, is his lead up into power, convincing the public, and then off they go to war again.
Exactly. Germany can renew itself, and Germany must renew itself. And by renewing itself, it's a sign of its own strength. Now, he didn't envision everything from the beginning. It's a step-by-step process. But yes, Germany had to come together as a collective whole. The individual was subordinate to the community and to the state and to the ethnicity. And it had to draw strength as an ethnic nation and had to remilitarize and had to understand that the world is a dangerous place and act accordingly. In his view, though, it wasn't just a case of protecting Germany, but also of making Germany inviolate and Germany invulnerable by creating the very continental empires that distinguished Russia, or the Soviet Union, the United States, and the overseas empires of France and Britain. Germany had far fewer resources, far fewer people than its other competitors, and it had to recreate for itself this sort of empire. And so that was the ultimate aim of his politics.
So he came to power, I suppose, and the modern equivalent is he would have been running as a politician, and then he came to power. That process that occurred, was that based on like a majority votes? Was it the majority of people?
It's so interesting because there's two ways to see it. If you study Germany in the 20th century, or just let's take the first half of the 20th century, the Nazis are the biggest phenomena that you have to explain. They're different. They're not an old-fashioned party. They don't want the Kaiser back. They don't want to go back to pre-1914, but they're anti-socialist, anti-Bolshevik, have huge amounts of resentments, blame Jews for so many things, and they get 40%, basically.
Wow.
In a parliamentary system. This is a huge amount of votes. And they become Germany's largest party in 1932, after the Social Democrats had been Germany's largest party for 40 years. So they're sitting there at 37%, but let's say 40%. And that is huge. They have so much energy, and the supporters are young, to some extent uniformed and armed, and they are the sons and daughters of the elites of Germany, but they also include workers and farmers, and Catholics, Protestants. So they are a cross-class party, but they're only 40%. They're not more than 40%. Hitler sees 250,000 people in front of him in his rallies in Berlin, and he thinks he's going to win and win big. And he thinks he has the dynamic and the tide of history behind him. But he cannot break 40%. Wow. And even in the last elections, the last semi-free elections, only got 43%. And then his coalition partners brought it up to 52%. he can't get into power without either the connivance of the elites or violence. It's not going to happen by a parliamentary majority, and that's the story. The story of 1932 is the story that he can't get above 40%, and the story of 1933 is the story of the connivance of the elites that then put him into power without the necessity of a parliamentary majority, but yet with emergency powers. And two, he will use violence to make sure that he can leverage his 40% or his 52% into total control, including the two-thirds majority that is required for the suspension of the Constitution. And so you have both elites finally agreeing to put him into power, and then his audacious use of violence, and that then consolidates his rule, which partially through persuasion does appeal to the German people.
Wow, that's incredible. An incredible, I suppose, what would you call that? Marketing strategy, bamboozling? Or...
Yeah, it's how you see 40%. 40% is a lot to work with. And he says at one point, I'm bringing 75% of the capital into these plans to create an authoritarian state and get rid of the republic. I'm bringing in 75%. Now, someone else is going to have to bring in 25%. But remember, I'm bringing in the great majority of the resources. I have the votes, I have the people, I have the press, I have the money. He's a self-supporting party. But it's only 40%, right? So it really depends how you see it. But in a parliamentary system, as you know well, 40% is a great deal.
Yeah, definitely. And that term you used, emergency powers, is quite interesting because that's a term that's been thrown around a lot lately here in Australia with a lot of government decisions that can just get made without any discussion, consultation. It's just, it's emergency powers and we can pass this law, that law, this decision, that decision. So obviously, even going back to then, there was things that could just happen by emergency powers.
Right, and he promoted the communist threat, and that's why the Reichstag burning on the 27th of February was so important. And he got temporary emergency powers to suspend basic civil rights at that point, and promoted the idea of the communist bogeyman, that there's a communist conspiracy. And many Germans believed that because the Reichstag was indeed on fire, and then was able to get the two-thirds majority after the elections in order to basically permanently suspend the Constitution. And these are this two-thirds. It's interesting how it happened. He allowed the communists to contest the elections, but then he banned the party after the results were in, which meant that the communist deputies weren't able to take their seats, which means that the number of parliamentarians in the parliamentary session was less, minus the communists, which means your bar for the two-thirds majority is also that much less.
Yeah.
And if the socialists voted against the suspension of the Constitution, as they did, you could still get the two-thirds if you get the Catholics with you. And that's the great shame of 1933, is the Catholic Party provided the two-thirds majority. And even inside the Catholic faction, there were people who very much objected to it. But the old tradition of factional discipline held, and the Catholics voted for the suspension of the Constitution.
So do you think that when all this was happening, you look at his strategy, marketing campaign, he's now built through emergency powers, he's done this, he's done that, he's now into Parliament, he's shifted the goalpost, he's virtually concreted his seat, he's telling people what they want to hear. Do you think at that point in time that anyone had any idea of what was about to come and what he was about to, the deaths of the Jews and invading the countries? Was there any indication, or was that just like, oh, by the way, we're going to do this now that we're in?
You can find people who understood that the Nazis were a pretty vulgar, violent, audacious bunch. And Hitler himself said that he was going to suspend the Constitution. And Hitler himself said that heads were going to roll in the sand when he came to power because of the criminal activity surrounding the revolution in 1918. But the burst of violence against individual physical bodies takes place after the election of March 5th. And then things happen very quickly. Within 2 weeks, you have concentration camps. You have tens of thousands of people incarcerated. Within 3 weeks, you have the boycott against Jewish businesses. Within 4 weeks, you have Jews being purged from the civil service, everybody from a post office employee to a federal judge. So this burst of violence after March 5th is pretty audacious. And I do think it does catch people by surprise, because by what standard would they be measuring?
Yeah.
The socialists had been banned back in the 1880s. People have been arrested for communist activity, but nothing like this. And the idea that in 7 years, 8 years, you're going to be involved in the murder of Jews, not only abroad, but at home, it is very difficult to imagine. And yet, at the time, even non-Nazis, let's say an established conservative newspaper, is saying, look, what is the choice? The choice is about the Bolshevik Revolution of 1918, which is painted in lurid colors. There's all sorts of stories about Russia. Or the patriotic gathering of national forces that we see celebrating Hitler on the 30th of January, 1933. No one's talking about law and order. No one's talking about the Constitution. No one's talking about legal order. They're talking about the choice is Bolshevism or this national revolution. So they've already pitched it in a pretty dramatic way. And that drama is just going to unfold. Can anybody predict it? No. But they've already dramatized it.
Yeah.
So the answer is no. No one could not predict it. With a small yes.
Yeah. So, and tell me if I'm wrong, obviously he had the media either on side or under control, because they became the messenger and obviously painting this picture.
And what's so interesting about the media is that not only could he project images on the media and the radio. So, for example, the radio constantly broadcast the cheers. First of all, he would interrupt a music program and then say, here we have a rally, Hitler's rally. So it would go from one moment to the next, from Bach to Hitler for this, emergency broadcast. And then you'd hear the roars of the crowd. And people believed radio more than newspapers at that time. And so the roars of the crowd seemed to be the roars of the nation. The microphone was just simply broadcasting the voice of the nation. Yeah. So you have these cheers and screams and songs. And so all the images and all the sights and sounds of acclamation, whatever their limits were, act as registers of national acclamation. It seems like everybody is going over, and that these rallies really do represent the nation. And this is done time and time and time and time again. And people, and then you see, well, everybody else is rallying. Yeah. I better rally too. I better rally too. And by the way, people also wanted to consume national unity. They wanted to consume the end of national fracturing. They didn't want these fights on the street between the communists and the Nazis. They had pictures of the old guy president Hindenburg and the youngest chancellor in German history, Hitler, where Hitler bows to old man Hindenburg, German history has healed itself. People wanted to consume these images, and those who remained cynical and skeptical on the side were increasingly marginalized and self-doubting in themselves.
Yeah.
And so suddenly it becomes what is an illusion becomes real, because people consume the illusion and make it real. And that's what happens in these 100 days. That's the most amazing thing. And even if you remain skeptical, you never know whether the Heil Hitler salute is done out of fear, opportunism, or genuine conviction. Nobody knows.
That's incredible.
But better be on the safe side, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Be on the safe side and go with the majority. Yeah.
But you also have to realize that this 40% of Nazis, there was a huge amount of energy, right? And so they are just bursting with acclamation, with joy, with celebration, with ambition, with a plan to renew and change and revise Germany, to unshackle the chains of Versailles, to let the voice of the German people be heard finally, not the Kaiser, but not the Bolsheviks either. And that Germans will come to themselves, will become themselves. And that 40% just had huge amounts of energy. It was very intoxicating, and it was very appealing. So it was very easy to pull in more people, even though some socialists, some many communists, and of course a few Catholics stayed the course. But most people didn't want to. They wanted to get rid of it. No one thought of going back. Now we have the new Germany. Let's make it.
And do you think, between 41 and 1945, you got 6 million Jews that were murdered, and they weren't just. It wasn't like on a battlefield. This is gas chambers, labor camps, mass shootings. You'd sort of think if that was 41, you think by 1942 you'd be going, what the hell is going on? This is not normal. This is not.
Well, it's very important. The big slogan of the Nazis was "Germany awake, Jews perish," which means that logically German life depended on Jewish death. And that was the Nazi slogan. And I'm not saying that everybody agreed with that, but that was there in 1933. And that legitimizes the violence and so on. And that the preservation of German life did require tough measures, because we've been through the revolution, we've been through World War I. But nobody voted for the Holocaust. Nobody voted for the murder of their neighbors. And when Germans, now people can excuse it, they can justify it, and they can, and of course there are people who promoted in 1941. But when ordinary Germans heard about the killing in Russia, which begins in August 1941, the rumor spread like wildfire. It took 10 days for the news of Babi Yar to get to German cities, if you were listening. The news spreads like wildfire. And the form of the rumors is really interesting. The form is that victims are forced to undress or partially undress. They include women and children. And the killers often go mad in an alcohol frenzy. So those are the three parts of the rumors. That means that the rumors are received as horror. And people are very unsettled, I think, by this. Now, they can, again, justify this and flatten it out as they do. And you can see that in diaries and letters. And then when the entire German army comes back home for their last vacations in the summer of 1942, there are a lot of discussions about this, but it's resolved. It's explained that this is a war of us against them, an existential war of existence. But the news is received first as horror. But then, as the war goes on, the Germans experience their own horror. They're getting bombed. More and more of their neighbors are getting killed in the battle lines, and they think about other things. I mean, the fate of the Jews is far worse, but that's not why you think about things, because the fate of someone else is worse. If your city is getting bombed, you think about your city, and so I think the horror of it all gets kind of compensated by your own suffering, and then you say war is war, right? The war does these things. Let's hope that the war ends. Let's hope for the war ends. Precise news about Auschwitz and gas chambers never arrived in Germany.
Oh, okay.
Well, look, in 1945, when American and British soldiers liberated the concentration camps into which Jewish people had been stuffed in the last months of the war, so Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and so on, they were surprised.
So it was sort of like a
we
shock.
knew about the gas chambers. The BBC had been broadcasting about hundreds and thousands of deaths since the broadcast of June 1942. The Polish national government in London had created a white paper in December 1942. There were prisoners who escaped from Auschwitz in 1944 with a canister of Zyklon B, and that was reported to the Allied government. Everybody was surprised to see these mountains of corpses and the scale, the comprehensive, systematic scaling of this. And you know who else was surprised? The survivors were surprised, because the survivors in Theresienstadt and elsewhere, they were hoping they would find their family members still. But from one day to the next, they learned that they were all gone. German people were surprised too. They knew many things. They suspected, the better way to put it, they suspected many things. They had heard these words. They knew about 1941, but the killing fields in the Soviet Union. But everything was an event, It's not pieced together as one big policy that rolls on and takes the Jews from Corfu and Rhodes and Crete and puts them on boats and then on trains and then into... Nobody thought in these terms. Even the Jewish Telegraphic Agency based in Jerusalem thinks in terms of events and atrocities and not a systematic policy. And so there is a moment of tremendous revelation in 1945 about the systematic nature of this, even though every fact is known. You walked in the streets of New York in the summer of 1942 and wanted to figure out what's happening, you would find out everything, including the names, the exact and precise names of the people who 20 years later would be put on trial in the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in the mid-1960s. All of this was available, but you didn't piece it together. You had the facts, but not the knowledge. Why? Because it was unbelievable. To us, it's still unbelievable. I teach courses on the Holocaust all the time. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, that was one of my questions, is how long after this did the German people stop and actually go, oh, well, what have we done? This is incredible.
Well, I'd say it took 1968. Then the fathers were accused.
Wow.
In the student revolts of the 60s, the fathers were accused. And Germans understand full well that this is not only the Nazis, who then become a very small group, after the war. But this is a much broader social situation, and that many, many Germans are complicit in all sorts of ways, through knowledge, through help, through giving coffee to soldiers at the train stations, through taking photographs, whatever. Every photograph we have of the Holocaust is a German snap. Why do we have photographs of Jews being killed? These are commemorative photographs. Have gone further than any other nation in the world in understanding this. And it's a very difficult knowledge to have. 16-year-olds don't want to go to the beach in Italy and be thought of as Germans. They want to be thought of as boys and girls. But that's just the way it is. And so it's both. It's a knowledge that is difficult to handle. And the difficulty of handling it has to be part of the knowledge. And I think that the Germans have done this quite well compared to the United States or Australia.
Okay. Yep.
But let's stick with the United States.
Yeah. No, we can throw them both in the mix. That's okay. But before we go down that path, what was Hitler's problem with the Jews? Was there one summary? Was it, I don't like them because? What was this underlying hatred that he just had? How do you define that?
Actually, I don't think he had a hatred. Or hatred doesn't even begin to encompass it. He thought in modern biological social Darwinist terms, in which there are biological entities that are given worthiness and unworthiness. And for him, the Jews were alien, dangerous, and here comes in his psychosis, a lethal, imminent lethal threat, and needed to be segregated out as fast as possible. So the old Christian view of Jews that they don't assimilate is the opposite of Hitler's. The great fear would be that they do
they would, right,
assimilate and go into the biological body. And so for him, it was just a scientific, hygienic separation. But of course, I mean, the hate, what you say, the obsession is that it's the Jews and that this has to be done immediately. But the first victims of biological cleansing in Germany were Aryans. It's not known very well, but 400,000 Germans were sterilized between 1933 and 1939. And 400,000 others were threatened with sterilization, but managed to appeal or, just delay the procedure, or then came the war. So we're talking about 800,000 people, plus their families who know about this, in a country of 65 million. We're talking about more than 1% of the population. And, but 400,000 people are sterilized. Aryans. And actually, it's very interesting, this isn't very well known, but in Judgment at Nuremberg, it's the figure of Montgomery Cliff, the somewhat simple peasant, at the trial, who testifies about his sterilization. The 1960 whatever movie with Spencer Tracy and so on. This is one of the only and first and only mass media representations of this. So they're going all along the line. They want a biologically healthy entity that will survive the rigors of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's incredible to think. And he had just segregated one whole race there of just saying, well, you're inferior to my view, and that's it. This is a final decision.
Right. I mean, there were little courts that would decide that, and you could appeal, and most of these people were simple, and some of these people were perhaps criminal, and in any case, they could be visualized as of the lower orders, but often they weren't. But 400,000 is a huge number. Yeah. And if you think of the 400,000 also threatened, and then you think just multiply it by 3 or 4 with the number of family members who must be involved in these situations. And this is anything, it's mostly depression, schizophrenia, but it could be hereditary deafness. It could be promiscuity, alcoholism, all sorts of things.
And you touched on how Germany dealt with moving forward and the repair after. in comparison to, I suppose, the Australian American way. What is that view that, what do you think they did do as opposed to what others didn't do?
Well, they had the greatest Keynesian project of all time, which was a rearmament program, and ended the scourge of long-term unemployment in Germany, creating the idea of the good old days, sort of represented by the Berlin Olympics, of peace and prosperity. And people began to resent Hitler for threatening that peace and prosperity, with his endless wars. They didn't want to lose the war, but they sure as hell wanted peace.
Yeah, they didn't want to be fighting. They didn't want to lose. Yeah.
But they didn't want to lose.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. Yeah, I mean,
but that also goes back to 1918, when Hitler had, basically convinced, but they had convinced themselves that Germany had been basically at the point of extinction then, and so it can't possibly be at the point of extinction now. So they still thought in the virtue of the collective versus the sanctity of the individual. Until the very end.
It's interesting because if you look at Australia and Japan, obviously were at war during World War II, and there was that thing that the Japanese were, extremely violent and aggressive and, ruthless. And for a long time, I suppose the older generation, it had a dislike to the Japanese, where now anyone that's, 50 and younger, the Japanese are the friendliest, most welcoming, kind people. There's a lot of them here that, you do not have, a younger person has no association whatsoever about what actually happened back then. They're very kind people now.
It's so interesting, Francis, and I don't even know of a book that discusses this. The view that we have even towards the Germans and the Japanese changing between 1945, say, and 1955, and then the Japanese get the Olympics in 64 that they self-canceled in 1940, changes so rapidly with a degree of depth that one really has to, maybe human beings are generous in a certain way. I mean, the Holocaust is not going to be forgotten. But one does deal with Germans and Japanese, and it's interesting with Japan that their treatment of American and British and Dominion prisoners of war was cruel, extraordinarily so, and yet the Japanese didn't start sterilizing themselves, right? Yeah. They didn't start segregating themselves. In 1942, there were elections in Japan. There's always discernible factions, between the Navy and the Army, between civilian and military, within the Navy. Yamamoto himself, who planned Pearl Harbor, was against the declaration of war against the United States. So you see a variety of factions. But nonetheless, there's a sense of racial superiority and extreme gratuitous violence against particularly the Chinese population and Allied prisoners of war.
Well,
it's forgiven. And then it's forgiven.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, I had a neighbor once. I think he was maybe Yugoslav. And he used to say, about racial tensions, every country's got them with their indigenous and whatever. And he used to talk about the World War, time. And he used to say, at some point, everyone has to move forward. At some point, no matter how bad it was, we have to move
because
forward.
That's what happened in World War I. The Germans didn't move forward.
Yeah.
But the other thing, Francis, what do you think? Do you think that Hiroshima is such a mind-blowing event, frame-blowing event, that we realize that something was overstepped, or something now has to change in our conventional behavior? I mean, maybe the vast destruction of German cities. I mean, the biggest death moment in World War II is actually the March raid on Tokyo, not Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that, in a way, does change the way we require ourselves to talk to each other.
What do you think it would have looked like had Germany not been stopped? If they had won and had, England had surrendered, what do you think Europe would look like now?
Well, I can't recommend enough the novel by Robert Harris called Fatherland, which has JFK's father trying to do détente with an aged Hitler in the early 1960s, when the sounds of the Beatles are beginning to make it to Nazi Hamburg, and the hair is growing over the collar of the young students. And yet Germany is fighting an endless war in Russia. But the Nazis were characterized by an utter ruthlessness, unqualified by Christian morality. I mean, of course, that sometimes bubbled up, but they created slave hierarchy in Europe in the mid-20th century. It would have been a disaster. It would have, if they had enough resources, it would have been very difficult to confront them, and anybody in their occupation would have been a stultifying living death. It would have been terrible. The Jews would have been massacred. Well, they were. 75% of Europe's Jews were massacred. The Nazis won that battle. They had a slave labor system. There was no education in Poland. It's not just brutal, but arbitrary violence. But the whole thing was so destructive that it became self-destructive. In the end, I don't think there would have been a resting point. And if there's no resting point, then at a certain point, the process of destruction would have become self-destructive, as we do see in the years 1941, 45. But it would have been an absolute disaster. My mother, my father would have been trapped there, and my father probably wouldn't have known he was trapped. My mother probably would have.
One other thing I want to do with you is the lines of similarities, because it is highly evident when everything was spoken about. They're saying that if you don't understand history, you'll keep repeating it. And there's incredible lines of similarities. I found one quote a while ago, and I couldn't find it again, but it was something along the lines of, people referring to, I'll give away some of my freedoms as long as I can have them back later, said by a person that never read anything about history. Little things like that, all sort of, even another one, in a world of propaganda, the truth is a conspiracy. And you sort of go, all of these things that were spoken about that happened back then, tactics, marketing strategy, political powers and string pulling and the media, they all resurface. And it's amazing how it becomes fresh again to the masses.
My best example is the notion that every question has two sides.
Yeah.
Why? Well, why is that? They're not two sides to every question. That suggests that the truth is sort of the middle.
Yeah.
And then there's these two sides, and then they have to be reconciled. I mean, on certain questions, there are not two sides. I'm sorry. There's not two sides. Whether we're talking about slavery, or whether we're talking about gratuitous violence, or we're talking about the Holocaust, there are not two sides. And the idea that in a political situation, when we talk about the two sides, that we should weight them evenly in the discussion. Let me just pull out my hand. That the Democrats have been as extreme as the Republicans is demonstrably not so. 75% of the movement away from previous positions has been Republican movement to the right and not Democratic movement to the left. But we content ourselves with very simplistic, even almost pre-political concepts, like every question has two sides. And that's where it starts.
Yeah.
But the situation that we're in is this. The world began with movement. We are all ancestors of Lucy, 200,000 years ago in Africa. And humans have moved around, and the species has extended itself and has been characterized in the last 100,000 years by movement and expansion into areas where previously there were no humans. And even thereafter, there were waves of migration. Are we going to simulate that for the future with climate change, civil war, and so on? It would be, in some ways, correct and nice. But we're dealing with also real political units called nation states and societies that have expectations that think in territorial terms. And this is the big challenge for the species, is our origins lie in common movements, even though we were violent among each other. And yet we're trapped right now in territorial nation states, which are not terrible. They've done lots of good things, but they're ill-designed to get people thinking about the challenges of the future. So what are we going to do? And the friction results in mistrust and racism. And Biden is not so different than Trump in the end, and the consequences when you're a migrant. People are not doing well, and they can't take care of their families. They're going to move. Yeah. But you can also understand why Germany can't accept 8 million refugees, right? So this is the big discussion. And in the meantime, one of the ways this friction works itself out is a redefinition of belonging and entitlement in terms of the ethnic nation. And that's then represented by the populists, beginning in the soft side with Brexit, and in a much harder way with Trump and Erdogan.
I noticed with our political system, we've got the two major parties, and then you can have your independents, but essentially only one of those two parties can be prime minister. And everyone has sort of seen them be, there used to be a very much, this, we're camped over here and we're camped over here. We stand for business, we stand for the worker, we do this, we do that. Now there's this homogenization of pleasing everything, pleasing everyone, and there's no, I suppose, they have a different banner and use different colours, but ultimately at the end of the day, they're very similar. And if there's a law that needs to be passed that benefits one and it'll benefit the other later, they do. Is that similar to what you see happening?
No. You see, that's the European view. And it's true, perhaps, for the Australian parties, and it's true, perhaps, for the German parties. But in America, there's a real partisan divide.
Right. So you got that big push
and
pull.
It aligns itself so that now every issue is snugly set on one side or the other. So there's not cross issues. I believe in abortion, but don't believe in tax hikes or something like that. Yeah. The partisan sides are just completely aligned. And then there's a racial tinge to it all, or more than a racial tinge. The American polity has been divided more than today only once.
Oh, okay.
And that was in the 1850s. But that was territorial. And here it goes everywhere. It goes through my community, goes through everywhere. But in terms of Australia, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday that said, is Australia becoming a dictatorship?
Yeah.
because there's all these pictures of
Yeah.
anti-COVID or anti-COVID. We're all anti-COVID, anti-vaccine protester. I've had
Yeah.
COVID. I'll tell you, it's no fun
Wow. Okay.
after vaccination. And the writer reminded his American readers that Australia has had elections or by-elections, has free speech, and national free healthcare, in which 1,500 people have died, which is 1/20th the number of the people in the state of Florida with the same population as Australia. So what we're dealing with a situation where we do not. I pay probably $10,000 out of pocket in health. I pay. My 5-year-old is now in kindergarten, but last year he wasn't. I pay $10,000 for childcare, and we're dealing with the only developed country in the world that has no national health insurance.
Yeah.
So sure, Australians can get mad or not so mad or this or that, but basic things are set. And you do not have 1,500 people. You only have 1,500 people dead. I know people who have died of COVID. America is a deeply divided, deeply troubled country, and and then it is packed into race. I'm afraid to say so, but it is.
And there's no easy way out, is there? There's no.
It's all constructed, right? Yeah. I mean, it's all totally unnecessary. But constructions can be super, super strong.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's interesting the role. I mean, you mentioned the protests that we had here, and one thing looking at what's happened is the media and government have created this huge divide amongst the forced vaccine. So there's a lot of mandatory vaccine. It started with hospitals and it's now spreading into everything: retail, banks, shopping centres. And instead of saying, well, we've got a portion that is they've had all their other vaccines, they're just worried about this one. It's no, you're anti-vax and you're them versus us, and we're going to get everybody angry and we're going to throw it out and fight amongst yourselves. You guys fight it out. Where typically the government was like, well, if we identify an issue here or a tension here, we put things in schools that make kids understand that it is okay to be gay or it is okay to do this. But on this occasion, it's like, no, we're going to let you guys fight this out, and we're going to call them an anti-vaxxer, and we're going to call you pro-vaxxer, and come and see who's standing at the end. And that's very much how it sort of seems at the moment, this method that they've used, and the media is just throwing petrol on this fire.
I'm a big left-wing civil libertarian. I have absolutely no problem with government mandates on this issue. And my wife is sort of Catholic and is vaccinated, but is really worried that the government comes up with these passports and division systems and tiered citizenships. And I mean, I get it theoretically, but it doesn't bother me.
I think that the big gripe is the whole, the other ones have been mandatory for schools and daycares here for a long time. And obviously they've been around a long time. I think it's that whole, well, if you can force us to do that, what else can you force us to do that we don't have a say on in essentially a free democratic country?
The mandates of the federal government don't seem to be so overriding in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of collective responsibility. The article about Australia mentioned, where we're constantly on the verge of disaster with fire, with insects, with animals and disease. And we must think collectively rather than individually. And there are not a lot of collective mandates in the United States. You need a driver's license to drive a car. You don't need anything to carry a gun.
Yeah, that is bizarre, isn't it?
And there are other collective responsibilities that we have to our aged population, which is only going to grow, to those with less opportunity. It's not a handout, but it's establishing certain foundations. In America, there was a point when high school was not free. Then it became free. Why shouldn't college become free? I mean, it's the same problem. I mean, maybe we decided that college shouldn't be free, but high school became free, and once it wasn't.
Wow.
It was not only not free, it wasn't mandated. But then it became a mandate. Everybody has to go to high school. Everybody has to go to public school, and it's going to be free. And we're going to actually take the children out of family homes and put them into public buildings with public servants. That's a lot of government control right there.
Yeah.
But we don't think about it in those terms.
That's a good point.
And the human species has not prospered because human beings are so adaptable by themselves. They're adaptable in groups.
Yeah.
And actually, it's altruism and not greed, which distinguishes cooperation and thus the success of the species, which is now so successful that it's threatening the entire planet. So I think the Americans have a lot of freedom, and we can talk and rant and rave, and I just don't see that.
You know, being like the Republicans and the Democrats you have over there, do you ever look at, like, if you're on one side of the fence, has there ever been, like, for example, in Australia, we have Labor and Liberal, and you will get people that no matter what, that's my brand, I'll only drive a Ford, that's it. But then you'll get a lot of other people that say, well, you know, at the time, this guy running in the Labor Party was quite good, and there'll be a shift regardless. Is that or is it very brand division no matter what?
It used to be much more in America, and local elections were different from state, which were different from federal, and to some extent that's probably still true. But what's happened in America is that there's been a alignment of local, state, federal, and then party. And so the crossover is much, much less frequent. And therefore, the predictor of elections is the primary, in which the party decides who's going to run, rather than the election in which you decide between the parties.
Right.
And that has become a trend that is much, much, much stronger. The other question you're asking is, do I know Republicans and do I speak to them? And the answer is yes. But it is very surprising, the number of Republicans who believe that Biden didn't win the election.
Oh, okay. So that's still a big ticket item.
It's more than half.
Wow.
And this is not an issue like, do we believe in this tax rate or not? This is a fundamental issue of how do you see reality, and how do you see the country? And also, all of this is totally distorted by the inability to see the fact that in the national vote, 6.5 million voters voted more for one candidate than the other. That's not in dispute. So they're playing the electoral college game.
Right.
And basically internalizing the unfairness or whatever we call it, whatever adjective you want to use, of the fact that the states and not the national voters determine everything. But they're already playing that game when they say that the vote is a lie. But nobody disputes that Biden won by 6.5 million votes, 52 to 48%. It's not a landslide, but it's decisive. And I'm just totally astonished. It's difficult to approach a Republican in a joking way if these things are so believed. And 2016 will be studied for many, many years. Talked about propaganda. All politicians are equally corrupt. I don't think that's true. Some are much, much more corrupt than others.
Yeah.
and some are more disinterested in the country than others. I'm not a Biden fan, but by any means. But the distance between him and Trump is like enormous.
Yeah, it would be.
And
yeah.
It's not just a quantity thing; it's a level thing. And I mean, one thing thinks he's a president, another thinks he's a hustler. It's very different.
Yeah. Well, if not for anything, it's exciting times we live in.
It is actually. It's very, very different. 2016 was an extremely big surprise, and you could add in Brexit there.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. That was unexpected as well. Yeah.
But what we see underlined is our incapacity to politically solve problems, combined with the urgency to do so, because climate change is here, and you know it in Australia better than I do in Illinois. But we have to solve that problem, and in America we also have to solve the problem of inequality in this healthcare crisis.
Look, I am super grateful of your time. I know it's getting late there over there now. It's definitely dinner time for you. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, and I could talk to you all day. So I'm really, really thankful. Well, look, thank you, Peter. It's been absolutely lovely talking to you. I've enjoyed it so much. Hopefully we get to speak again soon. And if we ever open up our borders again and you decide to come over to Australia, you'll have to come up to Queensland and make sure that you let me know, and we'll go out for a lunch or something.
Wonderful. All right, you take care.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you. And I look forward to catching up again at some time.
Anytime. Stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you do know anybody that you think would enjoy it, please do share it. And you can always find out more at bumpinginto.com.au. Thank you very much for listening.